Thank you everyone for your time today. So the Advice Quality Workshop today is going to go through our expectations surrounding best interest duty, know your client and the reasonable inquiries that are required, calculating sums insured, consideration of existing insurances, insurance through superannuation. So what's required if you are recommending a client establish insurance that's going to be paid using their superannuation balance. So this includes providing projections, contribution strategies, and alternatives that are available for this process. So the focus of this presentation is going to be on insurance within super. However, the concepts that we do talk about are all surrounding best interest duty and know your client. So these can be put across all strategies and areas of advice that you are providing. So we look at best interest duty first. How do we assess if advice is in the client's best interest? So when we're looking at a client file, the first thing we look at is the position the client would have been in if they did not follow your advice. So after coming to see you for advice, is your client now in a better position than they would be in if they hadn't sought your advice? The facts at the time the advice was provided. So this is the facts that you had or that you should have had if you were following your obligations under best interest duty. We look at the subject matter of the advice. So what the client actually came to see you about. What was important to them? What were their concerns? We look at the client's objectives, financial situation and needs at the time of the advice. Where product features have been recommended, we look at if the client particularly values these product features and that there is an understanding from the client in terms of the costs involved in attaining these features. And is the client actually willing to pay these costs for the features? The final assessment here is if the client is actually receiving a benefit that's more than trivial. So are they receiving a material benefit from seeking advice from you? So when we think about best interest duty, documentation is key. So if it's not recorded in your client file, it basically didn't occur. So your client file must indicate that you have acted in your client's best interest. If you can't prove or defend your decisions and recommendations by reference to your SOA and supporting correspondence, then your advice will be deemed as not in the client's best interest. So one way of ensuring that you have met your best interest duty obligations is to abide by the steps outlined in the Safe Harbour. So on the screen at the moment are the Safe Harbour requirements. So if we step through these 7 requirements, the first one is to identify the objectives, financial situation and needs that were disclosed by your client. Step number 2 is to identify the subject matter of the advice sought by the client. So what were they coming to see you about? We then need to review the objectives, financial situation and needs that are relevant to that subject matter and make sure that we have enough information about the client's relevant circumstances to advise on that subject matter and scope. We then have to make sure that we make reasonable inquiries to obtain complete and accurate information. So where it's reasonably apparent that the information is incomplete or inaccurate, your file needs to have evidence that you have made inquiries to try and clarify this information and get enough information to advise on the subject matter. Step number 4 is making sure that you assess whether you have the expertise to provide the advice on the subject matter sought by the client. So if we take this from a top level down, does the license that you're authorised under, does that have the areas of authorisation to allow you to provide this advice? Then you need to look at your individual authorisation areas. Are you authorised to provide advice on that area? Then you may need to assess whether you have the capability. So is it a strategy area that you don't often advise on? Or is it something that you are quite comfortable advising on? Step number 5 is if it's reasonable to consider recommending a financial product, you must conduct a reasonable investigation into the products that might achieve the client's objectives and needs. Once you've done that research, so once you've gone out and researched all the products that may achieve the client's needs and objectives, you need to assess that information. Step number 6 is making sure that all your judgments in advising your client are based on their relevant circumstances. And the final step in the safe harbor is making sure that you take any other reasonable step to ensure that you're acting in your client's best interest. So if you think about these 7 steps, 4 of these are specifically around the know your client part of the advice process. So if we look at step number 1, which is identifying the objectives and needs, step number 2 that talks about the subject matter and the objectives, needs, and financial situation relevant to that subject matter. Step number 3, which is around making sure we have reasonable inquiries to get complete and accurate information. And step number 6, which is making sure we base all our judgments on advising the client on their relevant personal circumstances. So 4 out of 7 steps are specifically around know your client. What it says to us is that if we don't get that know your client step of the advice process right, it's basically impossible for you to make a recommendation that is in your client's best interest. So on a whole, the findings we're seeing from advice assurance reviews and pre-vet submissions is that there is a lack of investigation into clients' relevant personal circumstances. So the fact find or the needs analysis step is the fundamental building block of the financial advice process. Clients cannot receive good quality advice without it. So done well, it enables you to understand your client's financial situation, needs, objectives, and values, and forms the basis for the advice engagement process. So completing the fact find is the first step in identifying your client's goals and objectives. These goals and objectives then need to be prioritized against what is appropriate and achievable at the time the advice is provided. So there are 2 key documents to note and support that you have made reasonable inquiries and met your know your client obligations. So this is the fact find and your file notes. So the fact find is ultimately designed to document your client's goals and objectives. So what they want to achieve, what they value, and more importantly, why. So why do they want to achieve these things and why are certain aspects more important to these clients? It also needs to document the client's current situation. So we need to be ensuring that we correctly identify the client's goals and objectives and ensure that these goals are not confused with the strategy that you are recommending to meet the goals and objectives. So we shouldn't see any goals and objectives such as the one on the screen currently. So establish a TTR strategy. This is more than likely the strategy that's being recommended to meet the client's goals and objectives. So the client's goals and objectives that may lead to this recommendation may be that they're interested in knowing what they need to do to meet their retirement objectives, or they're looking to reduce their working hours but wish to continue to have access to the same amount of income. So this section of the fact find needs to document what the client is wanting to achieve, not your solution to what the client is trying to achieve. So in the case of the transition to retirement example, on the screen at the moment is an example of a well-documented goal and objective. So the client has ticked the box that they want to ensure that their superannuation will fund their retirement plan and lifestyle. And they've also linked a dollar figure to this, so $55,000 per annum. In the other goals area, they have expanded on this. So they've outlined that they want to reduce working hours down to 4 days instead of 5, and they're expecting to get 80% of their salary for this reduced working hours. If possible, they want to keep their income level the same with this reduced working hours. They've put a long-term or a medium-term goal as well, so they wish to reduce to 3 days in 2 years and stop working in 4 years' time. So when we are documenting our clients' goals and objectives, we must be documenting specific, measurable, prioritized goals and objectives. So many clients that come in to see you will not know or fully understand what their objectives, financial situation, or needs are. And they may also provide instructions that are vague, unclear, or seem inconsistent with their circumstances. So in these situations, you may need to make further inquiries of the client and assist them to focus on some key aspects of their goals, to relate dollar amounts that may be needed, and to link timeframes. You also need to ensure that we're documenting the client's goals and objectives in the language that they use to articulate these goals and objectives. So we need to make sure that we're always avoiding industry jargon or technical terms in this know your client step of the advice process. So our fact find template currently includes these tick box objective fields. So these are to be used to assist the client in understanding their goals and objectives and should be used as a starting point only. So you need to ensure that you use the free text section in the fact find to document the client's goals and objectives in the words that they use to articulate them to you. So the client may state that they are interested in consolidating their super funds. So they tick the box, I'd like to consolidate my existing super funds. This will trigger a series of other questions that need to be documented in the other goals and objectives section. So why are they looking to consolidate? What is it they like about their current fund? What is it that they're looking to get from a superannuation fund that they're currently not getting? The answers to these questions will also prompt additional questions, and all of this information needs to be detailed in your fact find or your file notes. So the less work we do at the know your client step in the advice process means the more work you're going to have to do throughout the rest of the advice process, and you will most likely need to re-engage the client and ask follow-up questions. So in some of the recent file reviews, we have seen that some clients are outlining conflicting goals and objectives when they're going through the fact find. What we need to do if the client does ever have conflicting goals and objectives is illustrate that we've taken the steps to clarify these goals and objectives. So we need to make sure that we're documenting the discussion in the fact find and or the file notes. So if clients have unrealistic or conflicting expectations, you need to be explaining that their expectations cannot be met and seek further information from them about how the relationship should proceed. So you will need to get their engagement and their input about how to prioritise their goals and objectives. What are they placing more weight or more value on at this point in time? So your responsibility when doing the know your client step is not to document what the client is stating they want, but it's to understand what they want and why. So the reason for the client's objectives may actually result in a different strategy being recommended or in further advice being provided. So the scope of the advice may change once you have an understanding of why the client is looking to implement something. So a client may come to you to review their insurances. So when you ask them why they're looking to review their insurances, their answer may be that they're looking to reduce cost associated with insurances. From this, there'll be follow-up questions in regards to why. Has something changed in the client's situation and they don't have access to as much cash flow? Have they just received their renewal notice and their existing insurances have increased? These clarifying questions may actually result in a different scope of the advice. So in order to fulfill our best interest duty obligations, we not only need to have an understanding of what the client's looking to achieve, but we also need to have an understanding of their current situation. So you need to be comfortable that you have enough information about the client to state that your recommendation is appropriate for them. So if your recommendation is impacting the client's cash flow, it's important that you have an understanding of their current cash flow position. So we are generally collecting sufficient information about a client's income, but currently we are lacking in the expenses details. So a client's capacity to either pay for premiums or fund contributions or a regular savings plan must be a consideration when making recommendations that affect their cash flow. So if we move on to the second document that is primarily used through the Know Your Client step, it's the file notes. So file notes are used to capture sufficient information about your clients. So they may document conversations in person or over the phone. They may record provisions of warnings to clients and discussions and questions that your client has about those warnings. They may document follow-up actions that need to be done by either yourself or the client. They may document requests that the client has made, They may outline referrals to speak to other professionals or even conversations with third parties such as accountants or a legal professional. Your file notes should be made at the same time as the contact occurs or as soon as possible afterwards. They need to be comprehensive. They also must be legible. So if you are documenting your file notes handwritten, you need to make sure that other people are able to read the file note. They also should be adequately cross-referenced. So if you are keeping a combination of hard copy and soft copy files, when looking at these sections of the files, we need to know if there can be information sourced elsewhere. So if it's a hard copy file, it should state that file notes can also be found on Coin or Xplan or in the client's soft copy file. We are seeing currently a lot of file notes that aren't including dates or they don't actually reference who made the file note. So when we look at what actually should be contained within a file note, it must outline who made the file note. So is it the advisor? Is it a support staff that's made the file note? Obviously, the client name should be detailed, the date and time of the discussion that took place, the location and medium. So was it in your office? Was it at the client's home? Was it over the phone? Who was present at the meeting? Along with a description of what transpired. So what were the discussions that were had? Were any decisions made and agreed upon? Were there any concerns raised by the client? Did the client have any questions, and what were the responses provided to these questions? Any follow-up items that needed to be taken care of? Any warnings provided? Any reasons for decisions made, and any additional personal information. So if you've already completed the fact find and it's been signed and dated by yourself and the client is now providing you with new personal information, this can be documented within your file note. So once we have sufficient information about the client to advise on the subject matter of the advice, we can move on to the strategy recommendation, so developing our strategy. So keep in mind, when we are assessing if you've acted in the client's best interest, it's not only the information that you have collected about the client that is considered, but it is also the information that you should have collected about the client. So when we look at the strategy development step, currently there is a lack of emphasis or importance placed on strategic life insurance advice. So strategic life insurance advice includes advice on the type, level, structure, and affordability of life insurance cover based on the client's cash flow position and which prioritizes their insurance needs. So strategic advice may be provided as a standalone piece of advice, or where appropriate, it will provide the framework for your product recommendation. So prior to determining if your client actually requires a financial product, you must develop your strategic recommendations. So calculating the sums insured is one element of the strategic advice you'll provide when providing life insurance advice. So if we look at step 6 of the safe harbour, you must be making sure that you base all your judgments in advising your client on their relevant circumstances. So what this means is that we're no longer able to simply calculate the required sum insured or the need that the client has. We must also take into consideration the client's ability to pay for the premiums over the period for which they wish to maintain the cover. So in a number of our reviews, it's been identified that the recommended sum insured, and therefore the premium, seemed significantly in excess of the client's ability to afford or retain the insurance over a period of time. So there was limited evidence of any evaluation of the client's other priorities to actually found that there is a reasonable basis for the sum insured being recommended. So advice that recommends a client obtain insurance at a sum that is unlikely to be affordable to the client at that level of premium over time is likely to leave the client underinsured when the policy lapses or is cancelled. So precisely because it's unaffordable. So such advice may leave the client with greater cover, but at the premium that's unsustainable, it's not going to be meeting your best interest duty obligations. So before we can actually assess the client's affordability, we need to have an understanding of the sum insured that the client needs. So one of the most common issues we're seeing within current pre-vet and advice assurance reviews is insufficient information to ascertain if the recommended sums insured are in the client's best interest. So on the screen is an example of one simple process for calculating sums insured. So in this process, we look at capital needs, income needs, and existing provisions. So in each of these three areas, you need to collect the client's goals and objectives. You need to document their financial situation and make reasonable inquiries. So each element of this process needs to be linked back to the client and clearly explained in your SOA. So if we look at the capital needs section, we need to be looking at reducing any debt, providing for medical expenses, covering the cost of home modifications, covering funeral costs where relevant, and possibly providing an amount for emergency funds. If we're looking at the income needs, are we going to recommend the client replace their income? Are we going to recommend they replace their full income or a portion of that income? And why have we decided that a portion of the income is appropriate? How long are we replacing the income for? Are we replacing it up until retirement? Or is it a short-term replacement till the children finish university? Why are we replacing the income? So are we replacing it to cover planned or unplanned living expenses? Are we looking to fund any ongoing debt repayments? Are we looking to fund short-term expenditure? Is it for childcare costs, education expenses, or is it to boost their retirement savings in the event that they're not earning an income? So every aspect of this income needs section needs to be clearly outlined why we're recommending it and how it's relevant for that individual client. Once we've added the capital needs and income needs together, we then need to minus off the existing provisions. So does the client currently hold insurance that we are going to recommend they retain? Are there any investment funds and assets that may be realised? If the client does have an asset that they are looking to sell in the event of a claim, this discussion should be documented. It should be clear on the client file that we have gone through existing provisions with the client. So calculating the need is the first step in calculating your overall sum insured. The further step in this process is prioritising these needs against what's actually appropriate and achievable at the time the advice is being given. So we always need to be looking at need versus affordability. So cost is often a major trigger for clients to seek advice about their insurance, and a key trigger for consumers to drop their insurances over time as they struggle to continue making premium payments. So the sum insured and the affordability of premium are interdependent issues. So they will always both be addressed. We can't look at one without the other. This may result in you needing to broaden the scope of your advice and cover off on cash flow or budgeting advice to help the client understand the importance of managing cash flow. So what we are currently seeing if clients have affordability issues is that they're either being addressed by writing new cover with a different insurer. So this is writing the same level of cover and the same type with a different insurer without the consideration of any alternative approaches. We also often see the same level of cover being recommended, but actually changing the source of the payments. So more often than not, this is changing the payments from coming from direct cash flow to being paid for within superannuation. So if your clients express concerns about affordability, strategic advice must be provided considering the options that the client has available to them to reduce the cost of their insurances. So we shouldn't simply see the recommendation for a different insurer or the recommendation to change the source of income payments without other alternatives being considered. So some examples of other alternatives that should be considered are setting the appropriate sum insured. So keeping in mind how long the client, based on their situation, wants or needs to maintain the insurance cover for. So is it for a limited period to cover off things like debt, or is it something that needs to be covered up until retirement? We need to be looking at the type of policy that's appropriate for the client based on what they're looking to achieve. We also need to look at alternative strategies for managing affordability. So prioritising the essential and non-essential items that are being covered by an insurance policy. We can also look at the ongoing review of insurance. So can we increase or decrease sums insured at appropriate intervals? And what should those intervals be for that individual client? So what happens if a client specifically requests a sum insured? So we do see a lot of files where clients come in and specifically request a particular sum insured. And what we're seeing is that there's no documentation on the file relating to how that sum insured may meet the client's needs or objectives. So it's your role to engage with the client about the relative value and cost of insurance. So at a particular sum insured, and to help them arrive at the right type of cover and the right sum insured that's appropriate and affordable for them. So you need to be making sure that you're asking enough questions of the client and getting enough information for you to be able to make a recommendation that's in the client's best interest. So at this point in the insurance advice process, what we've done is we've collected sufficient information about the client for the scope of advice being provided. We've assessed the client's insurance need, and then we've balanced this need with what is appropriate and affordable to them. We now need to consider a product to facilitate this strategic insurance recommendation. So your product recommendation will depend on the strategy that you're recommending and also the client's current situation. So if the client does not currently hold an existing product, you need to be researching the products available that will assist them in meeting their needs and recommending a product. If the client does hold an existing product, you have 3 options available to you, and each must be explored and discounted. So can we use the existing product? Can it be amended or varied to meet the client's current needs and objectives? If this existing product can't be amended or varied to meet the client's existing goals and objectives, document the reasons why, and this gets included as one of your alternative strategies. Can we recommend an additional or supplementary financial product to be held in conjunction with the existing to meet the client's goals and objectives? Again, if this isn't appropriate for the client based on their individual needs and situation, document why this isn't being recommended, and this will be included as an alternative strategy. The third and final option is to recommend a replacement. So whenever you are recommending the replacement of one financial product with another, you should have 2 clear alternative strategies as to why you're not retaining and amending the existing, why you're not retaining the existing and recommending a supplementary. So these will go into your alternative strategies and have clear reasons as to why they have been discounted. So keep in mind you still need to conduct research and consider the appropriateness of the existing product, even if this product isn't on your approved product list. So if we move on now to if we're recommending insurance be funded through a client's superannuation. So what do we need to be considering? We must consider the duration of capital. We have to be looking at the impact on retirement savings. We need to look at an offsetting strategy, and we always need to keep contribution caps in mind. So these are the new expectations when you are recommending a client fund their insurance premiums from their superannuation balance. So if we look at duration of capital, what needs to be considered? So we need to look at how long the client can maintain their insurance for based on their current superannuation balance and contribution strategy. So is your recommended strategy going to result in the client having no retirement savings as a result of the insurance premiums being funded? We also need to be looking at if your recommendations result in the client's superannuation balance going backwards or depleting over time. So in this case, the premium that you're recommending the client put in place is more than the current contributions going into the fund. If this is the case, you need to be making a recommendation to make additional contributions, or we need to go back and look at the strategic advice and ensure that it is appropriate and affordable for the client. So when we're recommending clients pay for their insurance premiums using their superannuation, we have to be outlining the impact that this will have on their retirement savings. So the easiest way to calculate this is to use the superannuation calculator that's available on the ASIC Money Smart website. So what we need to be doing is comparing the impact those premiums will have over the client's retirement savings in the long term. So the information we need to actually capture this information is the client's age, their intended retirement age, if the client is aware of that. If they're not, we can just assume age 65, as long as we make sure that that assumption is noted. We need their annual salary, their current superannuation balance. You also need to take into consideration contributions that are currently being made. We also need to be looking at the amount of the premium that we're going to fund through super and their investment mix. So based on their risk profile, the expected return based on that risk profile. So to input the insurance premium and set the expected investment return, when you're using the calculator, you need to make sure that you click on the How It Works section, so towards the top right. There is an Insurance Within Super quick reference guide that steps you through how to use this calculator. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on the mechanics of the calculator today. If you do have any questions about it, please refer to that quick reference guide. This is the most sort of important section in terms of how you actually get that insurance premium and expected return into the calculator. You must click on that How It Works button, otherwise you don't get the field to add that information in. So once you've added everything in, you note down the estimate. Then you need to go back and do the calculator a second time without including the insurance premiums. So this will give you the difference in the balance if the client funds it through super, if they don't fund it through super. This is then presented to your client in the SOA. So it outlines that if the client pays the premiums through super, the difference in their superannuation balance will be the difference that you've just calculated. The important thing to remember here is to make sure that you include your assumptions, and it is a projection. So like all projections, it has its limitations. It's not going to be an accurate, this is 100% the effect on your superannuation balance. It's based on the information we have today, the current premiums they're paying, and their current superannuation. So when we're recommending insurance through super, we also need to be looking at an offsetting strategy. So how do we offset that impact on the client's retirement savings? So what we need to be doing is make sure that our file has evidence that we've considered an offsetting contribution strategy. So whenever we're recommending insurance through super, we will always consider recommending the client make additional contributions. If appropriate, we will be recommending the client commence a contribution strategy. We then need to make sure that we consider the impact on the client's cash flow compared to the impact on the premiums if they were being taken straight out of the client's cash flow. So now we're making a contribution strategy. We are impacting the client's current cash flow position. What's the difference between that impact and recommending the client fund it from their own cash flow? So there still may be tax benefits and other reasons why you are recommending the client take insurance through super, but we just need to be considering that cash flow impact. So if it's not appropriate for the client to commence a contribution strategy at this point in time, our file needs to have evidence that it's been considered and why it's not being recommended. This should also come into your alternative strategy section of the SOA. So outline to the client that you considered this strategy and based on their current situation, you're not recommending it, and clearly outline the reasons why. The last point when recommending contributions and insurance through super is just to make sure that we're covering off on the client's contribution history and their contribution caps. We don't want to be making a recommendation that results in a client breaching their contribution caps. So where can you get help if you have any questions about these new requirements when doing insurance recommendations? On the Advisor website, there is the life insurance checklist. So this is based on ASIC's report into the life insurance industry, and it outlines what should be considered when making insurance recommendations to clients. It is a 4-page checklist, so it's not a mandatory checklist that you have to complete and retain on every client file. However, it's a really good tool to be referring to when you're making insurance recommendations to make sure that you've considered everything that ASIC have highlighted they expect advisors to be considering when making insurance recommendations. So there's also the Funding Insurance Through Super quick reference guide. So this steps you through the Money Smart calculator and how to use that calculator. There's also access to the advice quality team. So if you have any questions from this presentation or any questions going forward, please flick an email through to the relevant advice quality inbox. So we've got the advice quality inbox at Suncorp and also the Guardian advice one. So this should be the main port of call for questions in regards to anything advice quality related. Thank you so much for allocating your time to today's session. If you do have any questions, as I said, please flick them through to the advice quality email address and they will be responded to. Thank you very much.